There's actually going to be two of us presenting today. So like Alexa told you, I'm Blake Chisholm. I've got my colleague Craig Fox here who's going to introduce himself. Probably 82% of you in the room know him already, but we'll get to that. I have been with AWS for about 4.5 years. I work in the professional services side of things. I lead global teams of engineers that help customers do a lot of really interesting things like moving entire data centers to AWS, looking at ways to analyze their portfolio to figure out how they can get their applications there. A lot of people say, what is your absolute most favorite thing about Amazon? Is it that Jeff Bezos flies rockets? Is it Alexa? Is it 1 hour shipping on all these things that's coming? And it's not. It's actually customers. So Amazon has this focus on customers, and I love listening to see what customers do with our services. Most of what you're going to hear today during this session is coming directly from ways that our customers have worked through the process of understanding how they're going to move their applications, what goes on there. So that's what's exciting to me, is really taking the information that we've heard from listening to our customers and relaying it to you. So Craig, introduce yourself.
Thank you, Blake. Good morning, everybody. My name's Craig Fox. I work at Amazon Web Services as an executive advisor. I've been there for about 10 months now, and judging by the Alexa introduction or lack thereof, I've got a strong data point about how unimportant I am now compared to Blake, so that's a good start. Before that, I spent a long time, over 30 years with the Australian Taxation Office in the public sector, of which the last job that I did there was actually helping the ATO move to cloud. So that's where my background is. Like Blake articulated, today's session is about sharing with you insights that we have from customers and the experiences that both Blake and I have both in Australia and New Zealand, but also across the globe, of customers who are working through that key question of, I want to migrate at scale to cloud, and how do I go about doing it? So it will have some elements of a technical response today, but it's also going to have a very strong business focus as well.
Okay, so we need to set the context for this talk today. So where are we? In the overall context of I know the word cloud to having shut down my last physical on-premise server, there's a lot of real estate. Part of the real estate that we're going to be focused on is specifically when you take a look at your application portfolio and you say, I have 10 applications, I have 1,000 applications, I have absolutely no idea how to assess those appropriately and determine which ones can even move to the cloud, which ones need to stay here, etc. This is what we're going to be talking about specifically. So you've already kicked the tires, you've walked around, you've kicked the tires, you've checked out cloud, you understand the security, you hopefully have really good executive support, you have sponsorship. Now you've made the decision to move, and all of these things can happen in different states. You've made the decision to move, now you're trying to figure out what is going to be the most effective way to do that. How do we get there? What are the implications, dependencies, etc.? So with that in mind, you would love to see straight paths to get there, when in fact, you're probably going to see something like this. Does that resonate with anybody here? Yeah. So Craig, when you look at that, what does it make you think?
It makes me think of the ATO's application landscape and architecture first and foremost, but that's probably why they had a sound outage. No, let's not talk about that. Look, I think this is probably an important point about, we do see this a lot when we talk to customers about, first and foremost, they might not be across all the information that they have about their application architecture and also their infrastructure platforms. What we also find though is customers tend to think it's far more complicated than what it really is. So we often hear customers say, my workplace, my workforce, it's all very, very complicated. I've got a lot of applications, I'm running a lot of infrastructure. I've been building digital services and digital platforms for a period of time now. I've been trying to put online services out there, and I feel like I've got that. And what we often say to customers is, we get that that's what it might feel like, but if we actually start to work through a methodical migration approach, particularly by trying to identify patterns and particular migration plans to suit those patterns, you can start to unravel this pretty quickly. What I would say contextually though is that there are a number of organisations, and we'll cover this in one of the patterns, who have done what we call a lift and shift, or a move towards infrastructure as a service. In some cases, even where that's been really, really successful and customers have been getting some great benefit out of that, we are finding more and more that your approach towards a migration needs to understand the full picture. So while it might be quite common and while it might look quite daunting, we're seeing great examples of customers start to plan and deliver a migration approach that starts to decouple and I guess unspaghettify some of that.
Unspaghettify. You're going to have to check Alexa to see what the definition of that is. Also, people in the back row, we've got an almost empty front row. I realize that you would then have to come down from the darkness and sit in the light, but if you want to, please feel free. There's plenty of seats up here. So we have the spaghettification of your application environment. All of these things represent different protocols, dependencies, applications, operating systems, physical environments, licenses. Your mind just continues to think about all of the different aspects of the application despaghettification process that goes on. So what we're going to be doing today is walking you through the process of being able to understand how you pull each of those apart and kind of have some clarity there where you straighten all of these out, you create the awareness that you need to see for how to move forward. So with that said, these are the 6 R's of migration. Okay, these 6 R's are really the meat of what we're going to be doing today. They encompass a path for every single application that you have. Yes, we took some liberties to make them all into R, but that's, makes it look quite a bit better. You can take pictures if you need to. We'll be sure to get out of the way. Also, on the way out of the room, you can tap your badge, automatically download the entire presentation. You'll have it waiting for you in PDF format. So if you want to get Craig and I in your picture, we can also pose as well, but feel free to do that. So retain, retire, rehost, replatform, refactor, and replace. This is really going to be the meat of how we go through and talk about these things. Craig, tell me about your thoughts on the 6 R's of migration.
The one thing I would say, I guess, in terms of both my experience in the public sector and also over the last 10 or 11 months working with customers, you'll often hear a customer say, I want to go all in on cloud. And particularly about saying, I want to kind of put the head on the pillow on a Friday night and be in my on-premise data center and then wake up on Monday morning and think, right, how do I actually just pick everything up and then move that to AWS? Can't think of a single example that I've had with a customer that says what you're going to do is completely lift and shift everything as it is right now and then move that to the cloud platform. So one of the things I would have as probably the first message for today is each of those 6 factors needs to be considered. And if you're going to develop a really strong migration or really robust migration plan, you need to have a strategy about all 6. And as you'll see, particularly for the first 2, they actually don't involve a move at all. So the notion of retaining and the notion of retiring are equally as important in developing your migration plan as what might be a rehost or a replatform. So you might have that thought, and Blake started by saying the notion of going to cloud is one that you've embraced, and that's fantastic. If you then start to think about how do I get there, our experience with customers is at some point of time, all of these 6 migration patterns need to be considered.
And one time I was talking to a customer and they said, where's the easy button? Where's the red button that Craig referred to that you push and it just sucks everything up into the cloud and we're off and running? And I said, there is not an easy button for a lot of different reasons. Number one, as an organization, there's adjustments that you're going to have to make. You're going to have to learn to be more efficient. You're going to have to learn to be more innovative. And so a lot of those things come through the experiences, the shared experiences of the actual migration process itself. Some of those things take time when it comes to procurement policies. Those don't change overnight. So even though the IT properties may have moved, the ability to procure those has to mature. And so you have to really think of this as a process. Another thing is when you move those, if you were to suck everything up, there's probably a lot of inefficiencies that are going on in your environment as it exists now. You probably have duplication of efforts. You've got things that are going on that you may or may not even know about. So think about the process, the journey, as really the overall maturity, the ability for your organization to mature to adopt cloud, And if you were so lucky to have an easy button, it would actually be a detriment because you're not having to go through all of the learning processes to get there. Okay, so remember we talked about spaghetti. This is the despaghettified version of what you saw in the first one. This shows you from the standpoint of your applications, when you begin to go in and look at them and analyze them, there are very clear, concise paths that you're going to be taking. So we're going to be covering most of the right-hand side of the screen over the next few minutes. What I want to focus you on is really the first two, discover and determine. Apparently we're very much into alliteration here. So we've got discover, we've got determine. Those are definite activities that need to happen in an organization. So you can't just say, every team for themselves, everybody, here's your AWS accounts, go do what you need to do. You have to set up that discovery piece. And the discovery piece is really taking a look at how do we look at our overall portfolio, how do we analyze that, create patterns, and do those different things that allow us to determine which of these R's we're going to use for each application, put that into the overall strategic plan. So Craig, when you look at discover, determine, how do those fit strategically into the overall process that we're going through?
So there's probably a couple of points about that for the group. One would be that a lot of customers will instantly jump, and I've been working with customers recently and some of my own personal experiences, will instantly move towards the rehost option. So they'll pick up a workload, or they'll identify systems of engagement, a website, some online digital services, and then quickly say, what I want to do is to start experimenting with cloud. And that is, and we'll talk a little bit about that in the next part of the session, and that's always a really good idea because it's a great way to actually learn by doing. So while at the moment the slide presents discover and determine in a linear fashion to some extent, what we've learnt from working with customers is sooner or later, even if you've made some really good steps by starting with a rehost activity, you are going to need to come back, because the question that someone always asks us is, how do I understand all the things that I have so I can develop what my roadmap going forward is? So even if you've got some people in the audience who might be midway through or on some part of their cloud journey and have done some element of the 6 R's already, if you haven't had a really strong discover and determine process, you are going to need to go back there at some point of time. We see this time and time again. What is it that I actually have so that I can fully understand what it is that I need to be able to do, particularly also in determining what the right pattern for that workload is. So certainly very strong about discover and determine. We're going to talk about a couple of options in a migration approach that might recommend just getting started based on some limited level of discovery, but you are going to need to go back and really commit to that over a period of time.
So this slide is a really good one to have on hand. I think as you go through the process of setting up what your patterns are, figuring out how you're going to make the moves. We don't cover all of the steps in here, but I think it's a really good slide for understanding that. Probably one of the better ones that are offered throughout AWS. So in terms of effort and then sort of the value that you're going to get out of each of these, you can obviously see retire, retain, rehost, replatform as least level of effort, least level of value to the business. Obviously, when we look up to replace and refactor, that's where we're going to see a lot more on the value there. We'll come back around to this because I think what you're going to see is that these don't hold true necessarily individually as a pathway, but you can build out the same sort of ranking process when it comes to the individual applications. Some of these applications can be migrated in one of 2 different ways, one of 3 different ways. You can decide to move one, or you could decide to retire it. And so I think as you begin to put what is the level of effort, the cost associated with it, and then the value with that, you'll be able to rank these as an application and as a benefit to the business as opposed to a pathway. Craig? Oops.
Want to go through all the steps?
Yep.
Should I put them all up on screen first, we think, so we can work our way through them? 5 key steps in terms of performing an application assessment. All customers work their way through these 5. Obviously, identifying the initial migration patterns against the 6 Rs. As much as you can, we're encouraging our customers and seeing customers actually introduce some automated discovery. Use a tool to actually find the data that you need to have to be able to understand enough about your business to identify what the migration approach is. Finding a lot of customers don't have the necessary level of data about their application stack that they would like. So the sooner that you can implement a tool to help you start to draw that data together, that will be certainly advantageous. I wanted to pivot and let Blake do the last 4 and 5. I wanted to go back to number 3, and that is particularly about engaging key stakeholders. Almost every customer that I work with will have an IT leader, they'll have a business leader, and then they'll probably have someone else outside the organisation. It might be a chief digital officer or somebody else who thinks they own an application. So you can often have 3 or 4 or 5 different people as a stakeholder inside your organisation that want to be part of the decision-making process about what you're going to do about their workload. You'll also often have, with a number of applications, a particularly boutique set of skills. You might have a particular workforce that's been managing that application for a period of time. So there can be a lot of things that you're going to need to consider about your engaging stakeholders. Also, for some of the applications that provide services to the community, you're going to need to have a conversation with those people outside your organisation who actually use those services to run their business. So it's one thing that we're seeing customers say, this is what I want to do about the application, but it's equally important about making sure that you've got all the other stakeholders who actually are influencing and are influenced by that workload as also part of the process. We'll often have customers say, I want to do this, I want to refactor, and then you'll find somebody else say, yeah, but I actually don't want you to do that because I've got an emerging business priority coming down the pipeline and I need that to stay exactly the way in which it is right now. So that engaging key stakeholders is really important.
So identify the migration patterns was a really interesting one for a customer that I had probably about 4 years ago. This was a large university, the east coast of the United States, founded before the United States was founded. And they said, you know what? We understand what we've got. Central IT, we've got a pretty good change management database. We can track the applications. We know what's going on. So we can just go in and onesie-twosie start to migrate. And at that time, I said, okay, well, what are the application patterns? And they said, well, what do you mean application patterns? We've got applications. I said, well, what do they look like? And do you understand that migrating those requires different steps? And they said, well, yeah, we'll take a look at it. We'll get back to you. And typically, I said we would want to get to about 4 to 6 patterns. That's going to allow you, and these are target patterns, right? So once you do your assessment, we need to identify and say, for each application, this one's going to be a 3-tiered web app, right? That's going to be your target pattern. And so they came back and they said, well, I think we're at 20 to 25 patterns right now. And that's just central IT. But then we have the seminary, we have the law school, we have the administration, we have the alumni association. All of these started rolling in with, probably 25 to 30 different years of different types of applications, and all of those patterns. And they said, this is absolutely overwhelming. What do we need to do? I said, well, the biggest thing is we need to get down to 4 to 6 patterns that are your target patterns. We're going to be moving into that. And so the process for that was really going through and identifying, okay, here's the assessment, right? This is what we're going to do with the 6 Rs. We're going to figure out how to get there, and then we're going to be able to align each application with a target migration pattern. Now, we haven't even talked about automation. One of the fantastic things about infrastructure as code is that so much of that can be deployed in an automated, repeatable process with a template. So now, instead of having to go in and manually configure all of these target application patterns, you can deploy those with a template, no manual intervention, which means it's going to drastically reduce the amount of error that we have in there. And because we had those patterns, now they were able to plug and play. Now we understand how we're going to get there and the application pattern that we're going into. The rest of it is just ensuring that the data gets there and then doing the correct testing after the fact. So, migration plan and design and schedule migration waves. We're not talking about onesie-twosie. We're not talking about just doing individual POCs anymore. This is at scale. So if an organization says, hey, we're going to do some proofs of concept, we're going to migrate 5 applications, that's not really going to move the needle. What moves the needle is when you start migrating 10, 20, 25 applications a month. When you begin to get into that hyperscale, now you're doing hundreds of applications. Because what you'll see is during the overall migration process, the shorter span of the application migration itself, the more benefit you're going to see to the organization, right? The longer it stretches out, you're going to see diminishing value because you actually have dual environments during the migration process. You have duplicate environment cost, dual licensing cost. You have to have people that are kind of looking after both sides. So you want to be able to shrink that overall migration process. So scheduling the migration waves is really when you get into kind of the hyperscale aspect of what we're talking about here. Okay, retain and revisit. Craig, what do you think?
I think that it's a genuine option that our customers often start with. They'll sit back and they'll say to us, okay, in terms of moving to cloud, the first thing that I want to do is leave everything where it currently is. And there are certainly some legacy applications that don't have a business case to be able, or a business justification for migrating to cloud. So as someone who's genuinely working with customers about helping them migrate, there are absolutely customers that have applications where the answer is to actually just retain that and keep it where it is right now. And part of that is a business assessment that says, I'm not going to get any significant improvement, and whether that be in business value or technical value, by moving that to the cloud. So we certainly encourage customers who are working through the 6Rs and trying to identify their migration approach. Actually leaving something where it is a really good idea. The problem is nobody goes back to the revisit thing. So they make the decision up front right now that says, I'm going to leave that where it is, and then we throw the challenge of saying, well, that's a good decision for now, but you need to take advantage of the innovation that might be taking place on the AWS platform and come back and revisit that decision at some point of time. That's the step that you need to make sure that you build in. The other point that I would say a little bit about this one is, particularly if you're someone who's driving very strongly in your organisation the desire to do something disruptive or to drive some change, be very, very wary that this is the first answer that you will get. People will say, no, I don't want to move, that application's too important, it's too critical, its security posture is what it needs to be, it needs to stay where it is. So we're absolutely reinforcing that you will have applications that you don't want to move because there's no great business value in the short term to doing that. What you also want to focus on is the second part in the brackets. Make sure you come back and revisit that. I've seen customers that made a really strong decision at a point in time to say, I don't want to move that enterprise grade application. And then there might have been some improvements with respect to databases over a 12-month period of time, or there might be a new SaaS option that becomes available, and they go back and do the revisit strategy, and then they've got another 6R migration option. So certainly it's very valid, but make sure as a leader that you're getting the discipline about going back and revisiting that.
And I think it also comes down to picking your battles. When you're talking about leading an overall migration to cloud, there's a lot of negotiation that has to happen there. There's teams that are perfectly happy with their applications sitting wherever they sit because they don't have anything to do with that. As long as the app is running and working, their fear is if you move it somewhere, it's going to not run. And so they would rather keep it where it is. So I think on the retain side, a lot of people say, well, 100% all in is 100% all in. We're moving everything to the cloud, we're shutting down physical data centers, whatever the case may be. In reality, if you have to retain in order to pick up velocity, that's an okay strategy as well. So let's assume that you have 100 applications in scope and that InfoSec is pushing back really hard on 5 of those. And they're saying it's absolutely not secure to locate this application off of our premises. You know what? That's fine. Because now we're taking that off the table. That allows us to go forward with the other 95 to be able to make progress there. So if you're picking your battles, and the battle is all or nothing, it's probably going to be nothing. If it's 95% or nothing, go with the 95%. So I think the revisit is the important part. You can then come back after the fact and say, look, we have now successfully migrated these. look at the success, look how secure they are, look at the efficiencies and the innovation that we've been able to get as a result of that. Now we'll go back and talk about those again. So retain is absolutely there. Also, it really depends on what the business needs. So don't feel like leaving things where they are is a negative. It's overall part of the process. Some of the reasons, the justification outside of the business needs from a technical level, obviously unsupported operating systems for applications. If we're talking about Solaris or mainframe, mid-range, some early Red Hat operating systems, some earlier Microsoft operating systems that are not compatible with moving to AWS, those would need to be upgraded. Sometimes, the application may be so old that it won't support an operating system upgrade. And so you have to take a couple of those things into account as well. But I think overall, the technical side of it is usually easier to overcome. A lot of it has to do with the business and with making the different stakeholders comfortable as you're creating that stakeholder set. Yes. You thinking about retirement yet?
I think about it almost every day. This is the really interesting one for me because every single customer comes up with a couple of key data points. One is they'll say, we have way more applications than we actually need, and we've been way overdue to do an assessment of our application stack. Every single customer says the thing. So retiring is probably one of the most prominent patterns that we recommend. It is one of the more difficult ones to implement. Really easy to be able to say, I want to retire some of those applications. The challenge is then is about how you go actually about doing that. Particularly because if you've got someone who's got, and there's a couple of things that are coming through for us about that. Firstly, they want to retire because there's genuinely been a duplicate, or when we've gone back and had a look at that application, no one's really using it with any great scale. So there's an opportunity for, we talk about the quick wins or the easy wins by finding those applications and then retiring them. The second part that's coming out for us now is customers are actually saying, I need to be able to retire that application because I no longer have the ability to be able to support that application inside my own organisation. And whether that be about skill sets or whether that be about the business justification to be able to do that, now finding a lot of customers being able to say, I actually need to go very, very strongly and get out of that business because that business, particularly with emerging other priorities for an IT organisation, my ability to be able to support that application is almost now non-existent. So retire is certainly very much on everybody's agenda. It goes back to that earlier point about business stakeholder. You can usually find something, there's an application that only one person is using, they'll be the most vocal person to keep that application going. So there is a little bit about application rationalisation, strong point around working with business stakeholders about that, but this is certainly a really strong option that we encourage people to take because every customer comes back with feedback that says, I've had applications for all for the best part of the last 10 years. So it's a really strong option.
Yeah, and a couple of points of anecdotal evidence on this. I was working at a hospital system one time, and the hospital system said, hey, we've got 660 applications out there. And I said, well, what do? They said, well, a lot of them do exactly the same thing. But what happens is a surgeon will go to a conference, and they'll give them free software, and they'll come in and they'll say, hey, you go load the software, and I'll say no, because I'm central IT, that's what I do. And then the hospital administrator will come and say, this guy just brought in a $6 million grant, you're going to load his software, right? And then what happens is now you have this sprawl out there. So the retire piece, I think at one point we actually looked at a lot of the application assessments that we did, and retire was about 30% of the overall portfolio, meaning 30% of those applications don't need to be running, don't need to be supported. You can get rid of them and move them on. The server under somebody's desk, does anybody have that? Yeah, lots of hands, right? The one in a broom closet. And in and of itself, maybe the hardware is paid for and the license is paid for, and we're not talking about cost, but every time it breaks, that's human cost to go in and repair it and to have something else to go. So think about retire and think about it in the overall context of the entire application portfolio. If you can take 30% of that cost, and granted what you're retiring is typically not going to be the the heaviest cost, right? Because you're not going to retire your ERP system. You're probably retiring things that are ancillary around the fringes. But if you can take that cost immediately off the books and say, okay, we're not worried about that, we're not putting any effort into it, we're not putting any cost into it, now what does that do to kind of opening up your overall migration? This is a really powerful one. So as much as I would love for you to move a whole bunch of stuff to AWS, I don't want you moving anything to AWS that shouldn't be there, that doesn't provide value to the organization. So this is actually personally my favorite one, because it allows you to kind of trim all the fat from your organization and be able to focus on things that are mission critical. Yes, the most popular probably.
You want to take the most popular one?
Yeah, well, I'll give it a shot. So lift and shift, your mess for less. There's a couple of terms of endearment that we use for this. Rehost is picking up a virtual server, using an automated tool, and then setting it down. It's literally that. And for a lot of organizations, that's all they want to do. They said, we don't want to go through re-architecting code. We don't want to have to build out new environments. We don't want to do all these things. We just simply want to pick and drop and pick and drop and get that speed and get that velocity and move. And there is absolutely a case for all of that. In a lot of situations, lift and shift is going to be the most cost-effective, the fastest way to do it. I think a couple of things that you'll want to look at, and we'll talk about this, but in the overall discovery process, typically what we see is that if you're virtualized, your virtualized environment is oversubscribed. The reason for that is you've already purchased the resources. You've bought all of the RAM, all of the CPU that is going to go into that kit. If you don't allocate it somewhere, it's going to sit there unallocated, unused. So let's put it to use in case we need it. The great thing about moving to the cloud is that you can then spin up resources as you need them and spin them down as you don't. So what we found is even in a lift and shift type of scenario, the servers that are coming over are running really cold. They're not running very hot at all, simply because you've over-allocated those resources. So instead of an apples to apples, we say apples to plums. Not even apples to oranges, because typically what you'll get is taking this and moving it into something about this size. So great place to start, and in many cases is exactly what you need. It'll also help you with quick wins. When the organization goes through all of these months of discussions and training and planning and cost analysis and all of those type of things, and then they say, let's start moving servers, and the 4 weeks go by because you're having to rewrite code or rebuild in infrastructure, that's a bummer. That's like, wow, we've done all this for that. But when you say, hey, look at this thermometer, we just moved 25 servers, then that success begets more success, and then they want to do the next 25. So I think that the lift and shift is really a great place to start, and that's probably about 60% of the applications, or of the servers that we're moving as part of applications.
And there's just a couple of bits of feedback on a continuum about the lift and shift or the rehost. So, and I would just express some wariness about not getting too drawn into either end of that continuum. So the first of those is, you'll get some customers that will say, I don't want to do a lift and shift because I see no benefit in moving to cloud. If I'm going to move to cloud, I want to actually do it. I might use the words, I want to do it properly, and we'll start to talk about re-platform, refactor in a minute. So there'll be a bit of feedback from people who don't want to do that because they've actually gone or pivoted on the end of the continuum about there is no great benefit in doing that unless I do that properly. Blake's articulated there are some great benefits by lift and shift, both in terms of the business value that you can bring by moving across to a cloud, but also by the bias for action that it starts to get the ball rolling. That's really, really good. The second part about on the other part of the continuum, though, is if you do start with a rehost, there is a really strong decommissioning and optimization program that you're going to need to go through. So don't just think that lift and shift is going to be the answer. I work with customers that get genuine infrastructure savings through a lift and shift. I also work with customers that by lifting and shifting, they might have created an expectation that that was the end state move to cloud, and it's not. There's still more work to be done. So it's certainly from my point of view, the number one reason is not because lift and shift or rehost is easier, it's because a cloud journey, a kind of disruptive change that we're talking about, actually requires you to take a first step in some way, shape or form. This is also the one where you've probably got really strong business stakeholders, because primarily our customers are moving systems of engagement, systems of insight. You've probably got some really strong business stakeholders that want to do something different and might want to do something with cloud. This can get you started. But I think the important point is this gets you started. I would say maybe 12 to 18 months ago, a lot of customers solely focused on dev and test or non-mission critical applications. We are now seeing our customers move towards beyond just dev and test, but start to move some production workloads, probably still assessing them as being less than that large-scale ERP system in terms of moving, but we are now seeing customers go beyond the lower-level development and test environments and start to move about to prod. It's a great way to get started, but it's one of the 6 migration patterns, not the only one.
Perfect. So a couple of best practices for lift and shift. Obviously, tools help out quite a bit. We have some internal tools for doing migrations. We have a database migration tool, a server migration service. And then there's also some great partners out there that have those similar type of tools. It all depends on the type of migration that you want to do. Some of them are actually block level replication on a continuous basis, so you can not only use them for migration but also for backup. Some of them are more of creating a snapshot and then migrating the snapshot over. So just kind of depends on what you're looking at there. Now the migration factory is a best practice because that puts structure around what you're doing. Now migration factory can actually be a full-blown set of processes and procedures that you're using, along with the tooling, the people to understand it, and kind of a PMO built in there as well to help you structure that. But basically what we're saying is figure out a way to be able to do this at scale, right? Don't stick around and do it on a onesie-twosie type basis. Understand the environment. We've talked quite a bit about the discovery piece itself. Challenge yourself to improve your architecture. That's going to lead us to the next one, which is re-platform. Craig?
Yeah, 3 key drivers. So in terms of, talked a bit before about continuum. Rehost to re-platform is a continuum in terms of, a lot of customers will start with a rehost and then quickly move to a re-platform. There can be some definitional differences between what someone thinks a rehost or a re-platform is. This is also where we're seeing customers start really strongly. And they're particularly about 3 key outcomes that want to go beyond a lift and shift. The first of those is they want to increase their ability to scale. So part of moving from a rehost or re-platform, particularly for those customers who've got applications that are supporting key business events that might have some volatility around the transactions of that particular event, they want to take advantage of re-platform to be able to scale. The second one really strongly then is around reliability and resilience. Are there opportunities in a re-platform phase to be able to introduce greater levels of resilience, greater levels of reliability, to ensure that your key business services are available at a greater level of velocity than what they are right now? The third one around re-platforming is taking advantage of the AWS security posture. And depending on what your assessment of your own on-premise security situation is, there's an advantage through re-platform being able to move towards a higher security posture as well. They're the 3 key drivers or the 3 key outcomes that we're seeing customers try to take advantage of, from going beyond just a lift and shift, which is picking up what we have and moving that across, to moving that across but trying to introduce some additional features. The one thing about re-platform is it starts to introduce that concept of additional time. So in terms of building out your migration plan now, lift and shift, there are a couple of great options, particularly for some sessions later today with VMware on AWS. This is the one when you're building out that migration plan, you're now starting to introduce the concept of time, but you are also introducing the concept of value. It's not a lot of work in terms of moving from rehost to re-platform depending on your application assessment, but that's where you can start to get some really strong additional business value. And if you think back to someone trying to lead a cloud program, it's a disruptive process. You are trying to demonstrate to your organisation that this is actually adding real value, particularly around in terms of those services that your people use.
Yep, and so a couple of the best practices here, some of these things are dependent upon the code set itself. And so if you're talking about adding load balancers, auto-scaling groups, to be able to automatically terminate, let's say a web instance that gets corrupt and goes down. You can then load balance over to other ones, spin up additional ones, maybe in some sort of an incident where you have a lot of traffic coming to the site. The ability to scale up, add a lot more instances, compute power, and then decrease over time as the traffic decreases. Some of those things are dependent on the code. If you're able to do that, obviously it's a great time to do it. Also, if you're looking at things like resiliency, as Craig said, you can actually create a standalone instance so that if it gets corrupted, it'll blow itself up, spin up a new one, and then get itself back up and running without having to have manual intervention there at all. So refactor. Now we're getting into time and cost considerations.
You want me to have a crack at this one?
Yeah, it's my least favorite, so you go.
I would say a couple of things about refactor. First and foremost, it is the increase in time. It also is in the increase in value, and it's certainly the concept about moving towards cloud native features. A couple of things that we're seeing our customers do. One of those is where they want to adopt a greenfield service for the first time, people are genuinely starting to move towards taking advantage of cloud native services. In this particular example of the migration pattern, we're not talking about the challenges that are involved with starting from a greenfield service. We are talking about refactoring an existing application to be able to operate on cloud, taking full advantage of the platform. So this gets us where the situation might have been. The business value is such that either the rehost or the replatform option wasn't available, or alternatively, you've moved a component of the application over towards cloud as part of a rehost or replatform with the notion or the idea that at some point of time you are going to need to go back and optimize that application to run on cloud. Particularly, again, about driving resilience, availability, security, and scale. So this is the one that I'm finding customers are really committed to talking about, but it is the one that relies the most heavily on the discovery phase. You need to understand your application and your business in order to work out what your refactor priorities need to be. Equally, for those of you leading a cloud journey, this will be where you'll need to think of the impact on your workforce, because this is going to require people to do work. And whether that be inside your organisation or in your partner ecosystem, the need to think about the resourcing profile, because this is the one that takes longer, and being really, really clear about the business value and linking that migration plan to key business events, because this is going to be the one that your stakeholders are going to be most interested in. That's where this needs to be focused. Sooner or later, I'm probably working with 4 or 5 key customers at the moment, and one particularly down in New South Wales, who are very, very strong on a rehost migration pattern because they needed to be out of a data centre inside 4 months. As a result of that, they knew at that time that they were going to need to go back and consider refactor options. What we were strongly encouraging that customer was start that discovery process now. Don't wait till after the 4 months when you've moved those applications across, because this is the one that takes a fair bit of effort. But this is also the one that gives you the higher value.
And I think when you start to look at the applications themselves, a lot of this depends on the age of the organization, what type of applications you have. In the United States, I used to lead a practice that was called state and local. So it was all the states, cities, local government. Many of the systems that we used for licensing and registration for automobiles, things like that, were built on mainframes. And so just in order to get them to an x86 platform involved a lot of refactoring, involved a lot of cost, a lot of time, to be able to do that. I think that Craig mentioned it. We haven't talked a lot about partners. I think finding some really good partners, AWS can help you do that. Finding those partners on the refactor side that are really good at that understand what they're doing, have the expertise and the capability is a great way to go when you identify which are the refactor applications that you have out there.
I would just say, before we leave this one, for the couple of customers I'm working with, refactor, trying to identify what workloads suit the refactor and migration pattern, and then developing the program of work or the waves to be able to do that is a lot easier if you had a robust retire conversation. If you've actually taken 30% of the workloads out of the business by being really clear about retire, and you've also been very clear that things are being retained for a period of time, that makes the refactor one a more manageable program. You don't kind of want to think that every single application is going to be refactored. It's not the answer. It's really, this is the one where you need to build on the good decisions that you've made about the previous migration patterns.
And so if you identify an application that needs to be refactored, one of the first questions you can ask yourself is, does that exist somewhere else in a format that I can just purchase as a service? Which brings us to replace. So in the final minute that we have left here, this is SaaS. This is software as a service. In fact, should probably be one of your first questions that you ask. Out of all the applications that we have in the portfolio, which ones have SaaS solutions that are very good, that are very reputable, things that we could just say, okay, instead of doing anything with these, we're going to move to a SaaS-based solution. Obviously, email is probably the first one that jumps up. Is that email system something that can be moved over? When it comes to a CRM, is there one that already exists out there that we can just purchase as a service? And all we do is maintain the data. Then the vendor themselves takes care of all of the infrastructure and everything else like that. So replace or SaaS takes a lot of the guesswork out of it for you as an organization. You pay a license and you manage the data, maybe some of the feature sets as well. So as we're kind of wrapping up here, replace or SaaS tends to be a really good option for most of these systems.
Yeah, and there's a couple of things in the public sector a bit about this. I think the SaaS, the idea about what SaaS actually means still needs to go through some conversation, but what we're often seeing customers now is not talking about just giving something away and sit there either a traditional outsourced or managed service kind of environment. What we're now seeing customers about the SaaS one is they're currently running an application, they're running that application in their on-premise data center, but there's actually the availability now to take that application on through a cloud-based offering. So we're seeing more and more now that our partners in the ecosystem that you work with are moving towards delivering their products, not so much on-premise anymore, but giving you that cloud-based option. So for my mind, I agree with Blake. I would be moving that one really up to the front right now. Yep. The decision to retire or to retain should also see, is there a decision to repurchase this? Then what you're left with is those three key migration patterns around rehost, replatform, refactor.
Okay, so key takeaways: reduce risk through tools, planning, and process. Go through this in a methodical way. Understand from other people what they've done, what worked, what didn't work. One of the things that's great is that AWS, professional services, solution architects, we work with a lot of customers. We've seen a lot of failure, but the great thing is we've been able to learn from that. And so the next customer doesn't have to fail. They can move faster, they can pick up from those things. And so part of the discussion here is how do we collaborate as a whole? A lot of what you guys are going to be doing today and over the course of the next few weeks is networking, right? You find similar industries, similar companies where you can share some of these experiences. And so leveraging the learnings of others is really important. And that migration factory provides structure around the process so that you can ensure to hit that hyperscale that you need to get to without running into a lot of the roadblocks that you'll see. Take us home.
That's who we are. Blake
That's
Chisholm and Craig Fox. A couple of things, if we just on the previous slide, one of the points about a migration factory, one of the first bits of feedback that I give to customers in my role is, inside your organisation, find some passionate people inside that IT area that actually want to work in cloud. Some people call them a cloud capability, some people call them a cloud centre of excellence. That's the group of people that need to come together to start to drive the processes that we've talked about. That's the group of people who learn by doing, whether that be a rehost or a replatform activity. That's the group that can help communicate with your external and your internal business stakeholders. They're the ones that will build up the momentum. There's some great advantage in learning by doing. So as someone who worked in a previous organisation that was very, very strong around a rehost approach, that's still a great way to get started. What we are seeing and what we're encouraging people now more and more is put in place the discovery processes that gives you the plan that thinks about all 6 of those migration approaches. If you do that, you will be well and truly on your way to cloud.